Edith Hall, welcome to the Inquiring Mind Podcast.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, obviously. But before we get into your book and everything you write about in there, can you tell the audience a little bit about your career as a professor, how you came to that career, and how you came to your interest in classics?
Okay, so I was born in 1959. I was a child in the 60s. My family was very educated. My father was actually a vicar in the Church of England, but extremely poor. There was no money at all, but there was quite high-level conversation going on. And when I was about 8, I found this copy of a book lying around on this really weird script alphabet. And kids are really fascinated by strange writings. And I asked my father what it was. And he said, "That, my dear, is the Gospel according to St. John. Would you like to learn New Testament Greek?" So I said, "Okay." And he, sure enough, taught me the alphabet in Greek. And I remember vividly that the first sentence of Gospel according to St. John says, "In the beginning was the Word." And I just got more and more intrigued by this idea that there was this world 2,000 years ago with these beautiful languages. So I was fortunate enough, because we were really broke, to get scholarships, because in Britain you can't get things like classical education at all in the state system. But I got a scholarship to a grammar school and so got allowed to do these languages. And I wasn't that keen on Latin, to be honest. I just loved everything about the Greeks. Went to Oxford to study it. And although I didn't go straight into an academic career, I tried to be a businesswoman, didn't manage very well. By about 26, 27, I realized that I just needed to be an academic. I needed to go and read more Aristotle and more Greek tragedy. And I got my first big job at 31, worked at Oxford, Cambridge, London University, Durham University, and I'm currently Professor of Classics at King's College London.
And why not business? What didn't work out on that front?
I was incredibly bored. Maybe I was just in the wrong business. It was shipping, actually. And there are some quite interesting aspects of shipping. And I happen to speak modern Greek, so I'd occasionally be sent off to buy a tugboat in Athens or something. But I don't sit well with profit-making commercial enterprises. It doesn't sit easily on me. I'm not excited by it. So if I hadn't gone back into academia, I think I would have become some kind of social worker or charity worker or something where the products were far more to do with social welfare than financial business. That doesn't mean that I'm at all knocking people who want to work in those businesses, but it did nothing whatsoever for me.
Are you not maybe a more client face? Do you like the research aspect of, for example, writing your book, or do you prefer to be interacting with people on a day-to-day basis?
I do both. Academia consists of 3 discrete types of work: teaching, research, and administration. So I love teaching, I love research. I'm the world's worst administrator. I cannot do it. Otherwise, I'd be a dean by now or something. I have stuck very closely to teaching students at all levels, and I've taught adults a lot, as well as I've done a lot of work for things like the British Workers' Educational Association, which is for people who are up to their 70s and 80s. And undergraduates. I absolutely love it. And I can't do good research without the teaching feeding into it, because I think the discipline, which is what this represents, book very much represents, of explaining complicated ideas, of trying to put them in a digestible and accessible way, is incredibly good. It actually improves your research massively. So I see it as a big sort of dialogue between being able to explain an Aristotelian idea even to a 5-year-old, right? And how I write. And I'm very, very anxious that the ideas that are too often sequestered in the ivory tower. Aristotle is not an author who lots of men in the street, tend to know much about. And I think my one great talent, is that bridge between complicated academic ideas and fairly ordinary colloquial conversation. So I set it as little challenges every day. I talked to my hairdresser last week about the difference between committing crimes by omission and by commission. And of course she could get it. Of course she could get it if explained in a certain kind of way, that you could do even more damage by turning a blind eye than by actually committing a crime. We all know that intuitively. She was just really, really pleased to be told that actually, some great Greek philosopher had written pages and pages about that. So that's my mission. That's why I'm on the planet, I think. And I'm really delighted that you've actually asked if you could tell more to your wide American listenership about these ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I feel like a lot of the, maybe not the academics that I've encountered, but when I was in school, academics at large, and no knock on academics, but are they have a talent for making simple ideas very complicated.
Yeah.
Because I was an economics and a history major, but in economics in particular, they had a skill at making, for example, microeconomics, which is very intuitive once you kind of break it down.
Yeah.
Making it very, very complicated for the average person. And there
is a technical term for that. There is actual technical term for that in rhetoric, which is obscurantism, right?
Uh-huh.
And that is deliberately studied clouding of what is actually quite clear, or could be quite clear. There are various reasons why it can be valuable for academics to do that. One is to get sort of respect and admiration. People think if I can't understand them, they must be incredibly intelligent. Another is that if commonsensical kinds of ideas about economics or ethics get too well understood in society, people are going to see through the power structures, and it'll change the way they vote. I mean, that sort of education has serious political consequences. I'm not saying that most academics do that deliberately, but that they're plugged into a system which has got, it's an intellectual class system, not a social class system, intellectual class system, which relies on most of the people most of the time not really understanding what's going on.
And do you think your upbringing in any way kind of shaped what your mission is in life, as you just mentioned? Because it seems to me that if you grew up in a very wealthy family and went to these schools and then taught a certain way, you're more rigid, and you don't want people maybe on the lower in the totem pole to know these ideas, but because you were raised a certain way, you realized that this is something you wanted to do and share your knowledge with people.
Well, you know what, Stanley, I think you have a great future ahead as an interviewer, because that's an incredibly astute question, especially because, I don't get on with my father. He's still alive. He's 93. He's a very doctrinaire Christian, Protestant Christian. Of course, I'm in touch with him, but, there's not a lot of real affection lost between us because it was such a strict upbringing. But every Sunday as a child, I would see him in the pulpit giving actually hair-raisingly brilliant, simple lectures to the congregation, explaining very complicated theological ideas, reducing really complicated chapters in the Bible to quite a simple moral message about how people should be behaving this week. And so I have this example, and the fact that I use the word mission, I have a mission on the planet. So I'm an atheist. I stopped believing in his God when I was 13 years old. But the idea that if you've got a brain, you should be putting it to the service of universal well-being. I have to say, thank you, Dad. And I have said that to him, that there was a great example. And he kept his sermons incredibly short, where other people would ramble on, miserably dull. for an hour. There were these 10-minute, really quite thrilling, not read out from a script, oral presentations. So although I don't agree with some of the content, obviously, I'm an Aristotelian ethicist, not a Christian ethicist. That set me a real example. The other thing I remember more vividly than anything, and I was funnily enough just remembering about this earlier today, because one of my daughters asked, what did I remember from the 60s? Because I was born in 1959, and she's writing some essay at university about the 60s. And the very first thing that entered my mind was the 1968 Olympics, when the two African-American US sprinters punched the air on the podium, because this caused this extraordinary row between my parents. I remember watching this on TV, and my mother kept saying sport is at a completely inappropriate place for that kind of thing. And my father was saying, yes, but if you knew what it was like to be an African-American, right?
In the 60s. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was being brought up with those arguments going on and learning a lot from them. And my father was often right, especially on race, never gender, never sexuality, but he always got it right.
Sorry.
So you put your finger on a very important reason why I became interested in moral philosophy.
That's an interesting way to grow up, because I feel like in some ways I'm the same way. Neither of my parents are very like pious people, but they
presumably they're Jewish from your name.
Well, my dad is.
Yeah.
My mom is.
Not your mom.
My mom is technically Christian Orthodox.
Is she?
Yeah. So my dad is I guess an apostate, but he kind of.
So you're not Jewish because Jewish comes from the mother, yeah?
Well, again, yes, technically, yeah, but
biologically,
yes, I consider myself Jewish more than I am Orthodox, for sure. My mom is an atheist as well. They grew up in the Soviet Union, so
did they?
That was the way of the world.
That must have been tough.
It was, but my dad, he's a Jewish man. But again, I grew up in a household where there were these conversations going on.
Exactly.
And for example, even politically, my mom is kind of apolitical until recently. And then my dad was, I guess traditionally Republican, and my brother was more to the left. So he was a Democrat in some ways. And I grew up hearing all of this, and my brother's 10 years older than I am. And it was actually healthy, because
it is.
Whenever I went to college, and I never, and I met people with different viewpoints, it was never foreign to me.
No.
Because I'm like, well, Republicans aren't bad people, Democrats aren't bad people. No. Like my brother is a good guy, and my dad is a good guy, and
exactly,
it's just they disagree on some things. So I think it's a pretty good way to grow up.
I agree.
But in your experience, what led? And I know you outline a little bit in your introduction of your book, but why did you stop believing in God? And was that the main reason that you had the disagreement with your father?
Yes, when they're very closely related, because he was no feminist. It was a very patriarchal household in a very traditional Christian way, and I felt not taken seriously, and my ideas, and my brothers got listened to where I wasn't, and there were structural problems about being a little girl in that household, definitely. But I don't know why I stopped believing. That is unbelievably difficult to answer. I remember being 13 years old and listening to some sermon where the bishop, it was a distinguished bishop, it wasn't just your ordinary preacher man, was talking about how evil the Roman soldiers who crucified Jesus were. I remember the moment very, very clearly. And me thinking, well, so these are working class boys in the Roman Empire who may have had no choices about what kind of profession they go into, who told by their commanding officer that this is a reprobate criminal. Sort of like, could you give them a break? Could we understand, not just dismiss them as I remember this sort of, can we try and reconstruct how these probably very young boys are just carrying out orders and can be a bit more sympathetic. But I had previous to that already had huge problems with miracles. I have a naturally quite scientific brain, and the leap of faith that is required in radical Protestantism, it is faith is everything, right? That you just have to reject everything that your senses and your brain are telling you, and just make this move beyond. I just can't do it, and I still can't do it. I want scientific corroboration for everything, and I think it's temperament as much as, you know. I think this is inborn. Three of my four I'm one of four, and the other three all go to church. What this did, though, was deprived me of a moral framework, and I do lay this out in the book. So from 13 to about 22, I was miserably unhappy because I had no rule book anymore. And the capitalist system we live under seemed to me to be saying, nice guys finish last, and that you should be out there beating everybody up to make your biggest profits. And I felt this fundamental contradiction between the sort of morality we're all told to be nice to people and be kind to people, and the actual economic reality of society. So I decided about 13, 14, there was no point in trying to be a good person. I could see no, what was in it for me. If there was no providential deity who was going to deprive me of an afterlife, if, as we all know, lots of good people end their lives in absolutely tragic circumstances, lots of bad people end their lives completely unpunished, I thought, I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to be, you know, do everything I can to make myself rich and happy. And of course I was utterly miserable. I was completely miserable. And it wasn't, and I took drugs, and I drank, and I partied, and I did all the other things that kids did. I was at university, late 70s, early 80s, pre-AIDS, you know. And it wasn't till I was 22 and I started reading Aristotle on the syllabus at Oxford University that I was so completely blown away by this totally rational, non-spiritual, scientific analysis of the relationship between happiness and virtue, which is what it comes down to, is you will feel much better and happier if you try to do the right thing by everybody. That's Aristotle in a nutshell. I was so blown away by the logic of it that I decided to try, you know, start trying to do it. And within 3 or 4 years, I was infinitely happier. Other people were treating me far better because I was treating them far better. And I felt I'd got a sort of purpose and shape to my life, which had been missing ever since I lost my faith. So I wouldn't call it a religion substitute. I would call it an alternative to a morality derived from a religion. You know, it's not doctrine. It's a morality that you build up within yourself, you nurture within yourself, so that you try to train yourself as a moral agent, with the big happy plum being that you will probably be a lot happier on your deathbed if you do that than if you go around treating everybody really badly.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that strikes me about what you just said is there is this framework that you kind of live your life by now, but there's no maybe leap of faith or whatever you have to believe in. But do you think spirituality is important in life? And it have Aristotelian the Aristotelian way of life brought you any spirituality? Maybe not spirituality in the Christian way or a Jewish way or whatever, but I think it's spirituality. Sorry, I'm going to go off on a little bit on a tangent. But spirituality is a little bit, it's subjective in some ways, because I don't consider myself religious, but there is a weird feeling that you can't seem to describe that a lot of people seem to yearn for. And especially in their 20s, where they're trying to figure out their life, and if they're not religious and they have no guidelines.
Yeah, I think it's a deeply human yearning. There is, if you look at Homo sapiens strictly anthropologically, it's one of the defining differences, as far as we know, between us and other advanced animals, or any animals, is this yearning for, I mean, let's give it the word, metaphysics. It's how do things work beyond what we can actually see with our scientific minds and our empirical senses. Yes, there is that yearning in the human being. I'm not at all incapable of feeling irrational, sublime tingles when listening to great music, looking at great scenery, you know, that absolutely. But I don't think I am a particularly, as you put it, spiritual creature. I get happiness from really quite concrete ethical situations. You know, I think they're quite concrete. Now, then other people might describe the tingle I have as spiritual. It could just be a matter of language, but I get very profound sense of warmth when you've got a situation where many human beings are together doing something good, right? You know, I get a real kick. Can you call that spiritual? I don't know what it is. I've had moments like that, of course, with people I love very much, whether my children or my husband, where you feel a bit translated to another level. But I'm not, it's not a goal in my life. My goal is a very practical one, to create sense of well-being and happiness and warmth and constructive society building. And yes, some people might say they get that my kick from that is spiritual. I actually don't see it like that. I see it more as a trust that Homo sapiens has got, yes, enormous powers to destroy, but also enormous powers to be constructive. And that when, like, nonkin, and that's the other great gift of humans, and Aristotle's very big on this, but when nonkin, so we're not talking somebody in the same tribe or the same pack of dogs, when somebody from a completely different culture and I look across a crowded bus and laugh at the same thing, or my little white baby smiles at the old black lady, you know, in the street who comes over to pet my little, because we're both mothers. Those moments make me buzz, yeah. But that isn't exactly off the planet, is it? It's a spirituality ingrained in planetary experience.
Yeah, and so when you were 22, 23, and you first started reading Aristotle, what did you start doing then and there, where you first said, you know what, I have to, sorry for my language, but get my shit together, right? And
yeah. I was definitely getting my shit together.
Yeah. So what did you start doing? And yeah, that.
Okay, very simple. This is all down actually to one book of the Nonkin Ethics, book 3. The two first things I started doing were, one, taking decision-making extremely seriously and using all of Aristotle's advice on how to make an important moral decision. Because I genuinely believe in our current society are not trained to do that and take precipitate decisions based on unscientific, non-data, emotion, passion, prejudice, all the other destructive things that make you decide what to do. And those decisions can range from who to vote for down to how to discipline your child, right? How to confront your husband if you think he's been adulterous, how to deal with a boss who's bullying you. I mean, there's just 1,000,001 different situations. So I started thinking very, very hard about decisions and using Aristotle's 8-9 point plan, which I do lay out in one of the chapters. And the other one, though, probably more important, the one that knocked me sideways, was the couple of sentences in book 3 of the Nonkin Ethics where he formulates the idea of crime by omission. I later found out this is very big in Catholicism. I didn't know that. I mean, they came later than Aristotle, obviously, but that he says a human can do far more damage by turning a blind eye when they should act, they should intervene, than they can actually by constructive wrongdoing. And for some reason, that rang such a loud bell with me. So that would be if you can hear screams coming from your house next door, you know, there's a kid there, right? Do you say to yourself, well, it's none of my business, I don't want to be an interfering neighbor? Or do you jolly well go around, bang on the door and say, what's going on? I don't like hearing a child scream. Okay. I mean, that's a decision. Or if you don't want to do that, calling the social workers or the police or whatever. And I almost immediately began at the end of every day of my life, in bed at night or in the mirror while I cleaned my teeth, saying, not just, have you done any bad things today, but what should you have done that you didn't do? So that's omission. And I think that this entails a complete revolution in how we, for example, assess our politicians. All our politicians have to do is keep their noses clean. If they manage never to say anything racist, never to harass anybody sexually, never to drop some kind of clangor, we call it in Britain, then that's fine. What I want to do is say, given your position of power, what have you done about poverty? Given your position about power, wherever you were before, you know, a rector of a university or head of a multinational or a lawyer, you know, what have you done? I want to know the exact CV of good works that you've done. I don't want to just know about what you've avoided doing wrong. And I'm afraid, to hit it straight on the head, I would really say that to the British monarchy. One of the things that, because our Queen is an interesting and I think a perfectly good lady, but people just rave about her. And if you actually look, for example, all the charities that she's a patron of are publicly available, and there's hundreds of them. There's hardly any poverty charities. They're almost all private schools and regiments. And I just think if you're in the position of being monarch and you could choose any charity you wanted, what would be wrong with a few poverty charities? So I don't think we properly assess people. We only assess them on what they've managed to avoid doing rather than what they've actually done. So all the time in my engagements with people, I sort of, I'm afraid, assessing them about what they have or have not done with that power. This is very obvious, I think, in American culture with, for example, movie stars and pop stars. It is very, very clear that some of them do not use their platform in ways they could, and others do. You know, it becomes really, really clear who is seriously saying, I would say Bruce Springsteen is a very good model of that. Actually, he's used his platform. I know, for example, that he's helped a lot of British trade unions out a lot with. He's never advertised it, but I happen to know because in the British Labour Party that he just sends checks over, right, to help workers when they're on strike and so on. You know, this matters to me. I have no interest in people who sit on huge wealth and status and never put it on the line for any cause. When they have nothing to lose, they're completely secure.
Right. And how far does that extend in your view? For example, a common problem I see in America and was the topic of discussion in past podcasts, where, for example, on a college campus, if, say, a professor peddles political ideas when it really has no place in that class, and a lot of students sit quietly, some might agree, but there are a few that disagree. And there's a genuine fear, and that extends into the workplace, to say anything to challenge the professor or to challenge your boss in the future or your company, because that would be having skin in the game. But I also understand the flip side, where because these people don't have status and wealth that they can, you know, rely on if they do get fired, why would they do it?
Exactly. But Stanley, if you listen to what I was just saying, I said precisely the people who are really secure in their wealth and status.
Right.
Those are the ones I judge. If they've got absolutely nothing to lose, that, you know, they're rich and famous and they can live off their current holdings for the rest of their life, and not to use that as a platform is completely different from if you're on some 0 hours contract trying to feed your children. and you've got to keep quiet because your boss is a tyrant. I mean, absolutely. I made that distinction very carefully. I was talking about totally secure people. I put this very much into action in my own life, because once I got tenure, and in academia, tenure is this big deal. Once I got tenure, before I got tenure, of course I kept my mouth shut sometimes. Of course I did. But that was part of the long game to get tenure. And since then, I've supported untenured younger academics and cleaning staff and security staff and domestic workers at the university on every single occasion I can, because nobody can really hurt me, right? So that's the difference. I wouldn't for a minute expect someone in a vulnerable position on the breadline, especially with dependents, to step around being a hero. And absolutely not. So don't misunderstand me.
No, I completely understood, but I'm saying I understand if you don't have a certain status wealth to fall back on. In many ways, I think, for example, American universities in a lot of ways are failing kids because they don't open up that dialogue. Like they don't let kids freely speak their mind.
No.
And the reason it, again, later extends to the workplace is because that's the way, people always think, when I get like a tenured position, or when I get a certain position in life, then I will speak out. But that could take decades,
But also, what has gone wrong with our society? We're supposed to be this free society with freedom of speech. And I've watched over the last 20 years actually terror about expressing opinions. In fact, increasingly large walks of life, worse in the USA than in Britain, slightly. But I think fear is just one of our most common cultural experiences. I know my kids in their early 20s, completely insecure, no tenured job in sight, no household mortgage in sight, all the rest of it, live in fear. They're living in fear of destitution. And these are middle-class kids. These are not kids from a poor neighborhood with high crime rates. So something has gone really wrong with the truly good principle of freedom of speech at all levels, without fear. And I think it's getting worse. And I think that social media is helping it to get worse. People piling in on everybody else. And I'm really worried about it. My generation, freedom was really everything. I watch my kids' generation, and actually it's safety. They don't feel safe. I felt safe, so I could go around shouting about, I wanted to be free. They don't even feel safe that they're going to be financially, after that the planet is still going to be working, that there are actually going to be jobs. There's been, in the last 30 years, a radical shift in the state of mind of young adults.
Yeah. Well, the reason is because I think we're also playing the long game, right? And you think what I say now is going to come and bite me in the ass in the future. And that's
even more with social media, where it's
and that's so concerning, because when else are you supposed to make mistakes? You can't go through life without making a mistake.
Of course not.
And that's the way you learn. But there is a fear, and the reason people resort to safety is because they go, well, I don't know if that employer won't hire me. That employer won't hire me because I expressed a certain viewpoint politically 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so it's a little.
Hate that. Yeah. I hate that. And I think I wouldn't have survived if videos of me expatiating in 1980 were around. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I feel very, very relieved that's how it is. But something has gone wrong with our sense of the importance of freedom of expression. It really has.
And the bizarre thing to me before we
balance.
Oh, sorry.
No, we should probably move on, because I can't talk all night. And
sorry.
I'm talking too much. No, don't you apologize. I'm talking too much.
What I liked about your book compared to, so I had a Stoic on my podcast, so Massimo Pigliucci.
Oh, Massimo. Oh.
Huh?
He doesn't like me.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He doesn't know me, but he thinks I am hard on it, on Stoicism, which is true.
And then I had an Epicurean,
Yeah,
Catherine Wilson, on my
yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
And both are very interesting philosophies.
yeah.
The first one I was introduced to was Stoicism, and I liked it for a second, and then they lost me. Epicureanism is interesting, but I don't like the whole don't get involved in politics or
No, that's
public
a
life.
big problem, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
don't engage.
What I liked about yours is it just fit my life in some way. I'm like, this is kind of what I want to live my life by. So what are your, how are Aristotelian ethics different than Stoicism and Epicureanism?
Okay, well, the Aristotelian model of the human differs from the Epicurean one, as you've already said, very importantly, because Aristotle believes in society, believes in the community, believes in business, believes in trade, believes in social engagement, thinks that people who are gifted actually have a duty to contribute their gifts to the public life one way or another. And he thinks that collective life and the engagement of people, even if they've got huge IQs and they're very good at philosophy, with the granular nitty-gritty details of everyday doing and getting and spending and having kids, is crucial. So that's the difference between him and Epicureanism. The difference between Aristotelianism and Stoicism is all down to emotions. Everything's about emotions. Whatever some neo-Stoics say, including ones you may have interviewed, if you actually read the ancient Stoic texts, authentic Stoicism is entirely repressive of emotion and instinct. The entire trick is to, and the words are all very masculine and very violent, to master and dominate and conquer your emotions, your passions, your instincts. All right. So you smile in the face of death. You despise your wife when she cries because you've lost a child. If you feel sexually turned on, instead of thinking about that, what does it mean? Right. You beat yourself until it stops. Right. It's not, to my mind, at all compatible with the dominant model of the psyche and the psychosomatic unity of ourselves that has come up since Freud. And the one that is the peripatetic model of the soul, which says that body and mind are not separate, that your intellectual conscious life is an organic response to your bodily life, and that all instincts, passions, and emotions is not a matter of being either good or bad, but they're on a spectrum. So that, take anger, for example. Now, a Stoic would say that the angry man is temporarily crazy. He's irrational and needs to stop it as soon as possible. Okay. Aristotle says, well, actually, that's not right at all. In fact, but he was before Stoics. Stoics happened a generation after him. He would say to his teacher, Plato, who had also said anger was ridiculous and mad and out of control. Aristotle says, well, look, what about all the occasions when without anger, you wouldn't be an effective moral agent? Without anger, Martin Luther King would not have led the Selma marches. Without anger, if your kid is bullied at school, you're not going to go to the head teacher and say, I need to know why my kid is coming home from school bruised and crying. Anger, if properly used, is a force for moral good. It stops being that on the other extreme when you're angry out of place at the wrong time with the wrong person and in a bad, to a bad extent, to a bad degree. But that is no worse than never having any anger at all, sitting on the sofa while you watch your child being beaten up. Yeah. Now, for me, as a very emotional and passionate 20-something, this resounded so loudly. I'd been told by Christians who are, it's very similar to Platonism, that everything to do with the body is bad, everything to do with the spirit and the mind is. And to find a philosopher who said, actually, no, that's completely wrong. It's fine to be angry. What you need to do is devote an enormous amount of time about thinking, why do I feel angry? Who is actually at fault? And what can I constructively do about with that anger? So this was music to my ears, and this is fundamentally different from all the other ancient schools of philosophy: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, Platonism, Pyrrhonism. You know, that there are about 7 ancient schools of philosophy. The only one that says emotion at the right time, in the right place, in the right degree is good, and bodies are good. You know, Aristotle thinks sex is great because it can really, really make your ethical relationship with your primary partner, you know, wonderful. He thinks eating a desire for delicious food is really good because it will point you to nutritious food, right? So it's about, it's just much more humane and much more modern and much more post-Freudian.
Yeah, and one of the big themes in your book is about happiness, and what I realized with Stoicism is, I would read about it. It's very interesting, but it doesn't make you happy. Like, it's just, they don't seem like very happy people, you know.
It's not a goal. It's not a goal.
No, it's not.
Eudaimonia, which is the Greek for this state of well-being or felicity, that doing good constantly or trying to do good constantly puts you into this optimistic, constructive frame of mind. It doesn't exist in Stoicism. There's no goal of happiness. There's goals of living according to reason, living according to self-control, and becoming untouchable by the emotions of the world. I don't want to be untouchable by the emotions of the world. I also think it's extremely gendered. I think that the Stoicism was very much the ideology of the ancient Roman male who never wanted to expose emotional vulnerability. We would probably now say one of society's great problems is that men are not allowed to be emotionally vulnerable, which is why there are such high suicide rates amongst men, which is why families fall apart, because men can't be openly affectionate, you know, to what soppy. Do you have the word soppy? You know, they can't sort of express themselves emotionally with tears and affection and hugs and intimacy. A lot of us would say that that's a huge problem. So I would actually say that Stoicism's ideal of masculine behavior, it didn't have an ideal of feminine behavior. Women just didn't count. They're just sort of breeding machines. I think that Aristotelianism, despite certain patriarchal features in it, which are inevitable with any ancient philosophy, is far more appealing to women, because it says passion, emotion, and the body are all utter gifts to be thoroughly enjoyed in a rational way.
One of the interesting things about that I read, it was I think a little bit of you criticizing Aristotle a little bit because of his views on women and all that, which made me think of a interesting, I guess, question for you, because how do you view history? Should we view history from our current moral standards, or try to apply historical standards and try to understand where they're coming from? This extends to topics such as slavery, obviously,
Yeah.
and they should have known better, like 500 years ago. Obviously, I mean, we would like to think that, but how do you judge history and historical figures?
Well, this is terribly topical, as I'm sure you know. There are plenty of people arguing for decolonizing the curriculum, and that basically discarding, you know, all the great authors of the past. I think fundamentally I'm an 18th century radical Enlightenment girl. Okay, the radical Enlightenment is one that says, look, every idea and development, a bit of progress that humans have ever had, whether scientifically or intellectually, is part of a progress program and needs celebrating, analysing and understanding. The human project is only, in literate terms, a few thousand years old, which is true, and that we don't just chuck out all the babies with all the bathwaters. That's the first thing I would say. The second is, and I say it very clearly in the book, but that the unique thing about Aristotle when he's talking about, for example, political constitutions or even just personal psyche, is that the sort of fetishization of consistency and never changing your mind is hugely problematic. He says both the individual, moral agent, so you or me, and the state, so the United States of America or the United Kingdom, has to be eternally open to revising its views if either new evidence or new argumentation is presented.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he actually gives examples from political history, like that. He says in the olden days in Greece, we used to buy our wives. And then we then realized that was treating them like cattle, and that wouldn't do. And we stopped doing that, right? Mm-hmm. We presented with new evidence and we stopped doing it. The other one, which is interesting in the American situation with the NRA, is he says in the olden days, we used to carry arms in the city-state, right? We wouldn't go to the assembly undefended by a weapon. But we learned that that was to erode trust, okay, and that it was much better for us all to go unarmed to the assembly and cannot carry arms in the market square and so on. And I do find that kind of flesh crawling when you look at the discussions today about armed civilians. So he comes up with these things, and I just know that if I could present him with the now extraordinarily enormous scientific data that all Homo sapiens have the same random distribution of intelligence, and that there is no genetic gap in intelligence between men and women whatsoever. We do have slightly different brains, the science would say, like women are better at communication, men slightly better at spatial awareness, you know, but that's interesting, right? That is not a hierarchical relationship, that is a complementary relationship. And he was completely adamant like that. And he would look at, for example, the fetishization of the founding fathers with despair, with absolute despair. Of course, they had some good principles in their own time. They worked out actually with remarkable skill. I mean, you know, my admiration for Jefferson, you know, and I'm sure Aristotle would be enormous, but, you know, they got it wrong on slavery and women, excuse me. And they've had to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we could correct Aristotle here right now.
That's an interesting.
It's openness to new data or argument.
Right. Another thing that I guess read about you in my research for this podcast is you've fought for classics to be taught in universities, and you're very, well, obviously adamant on that, and you teach classics.
Oh.
I personally did not receive a classics education. It's a regret of mine, but it's not really my fault. But
of course it's not.
It wasn't taught in school. But
you're obviously thirsting for these ideas now.
Yeah, for sure. But it's always I find it beneficial when you can read ancient text with a professor who knows the text inside and out and kind of go and discuss it, and I could read it in my house by myself, but it's not the same. Can you explain to Americans and maybe to Brits as well why classics are so important and why we should teach them in universities?
Okay. Okay, so humans have had 6 extraordinary revolutions. All right. In about 70,000 BC, we started standing upright and talking to each other. That's the cognitive revolution. In about 8,000 BC, we started farming and building cities. All right, agricultural revolution. skip to the 15th century, we started printing, changed everything, meant that text could go all over the world. Ideology can go all over the world, unlimited. Industrial revolution changed everything. And we're now living the digital revolution, which is changing the way we relate. What I've skipped over is the 1,000 years between about 700 BC and about 400 AD, where everything about our intellects was created. Absolutely everything. Every discipline we study at university, from natural science to philosophy to logic to history to geography to theatre to literature to aesthetics to psychology, every genre that we read, whether it's biography or fiction or oratory, the ferment of the Greek intellectual revolution created the insides of our heads. Also, some of the imaginative stories that still fuel us on so very far, like the Odyssey and Aesop's fables. So, to my mind, if you get through school without knowing anything about the 1,000 years that created the human intellect, your education has failed you, right? Most kids do know a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, printing, Gutenberg, when they leave school. But if they don't know when the idea of democracy was invented, and they don't know when theatre was invented, and they don't know whether the very concept of epistemology, which sounds like a long word, but simply means the philosophy of knowledge, how do we know what we know, and how do we know that it's true? When all of these ideas were first evolved without gods interfering, rational, then we have completely failed to educate kids and give them the sort of cultural literacy that will ground them in what it is to be truly a human. I passionately believe this. And currently I'm campaigning to get some compulsory, not Latin or Greek, but some compulsory study of just classical civilization, like politics and philosophy and history, into every state school in the land. And we're doing very well. People are coming around to it. So I wouldn't have asked you to do any majoring in it at high school or anything. I'd have said, give me a lad of 13, let me have him for an hour a week for 2 years, and he'll know who Pericles was. He'll know who Julius Caesar was. He'll know what the Parthenon is. He'll know what tragedy is. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Can you bring that to the States by any chance?
That's exactly what, and that should be alongside citizenship skills.
Yeah.
And basic, whatever they call it, personal relationships, where, essential skills. What it is to be a human was pretty much invented in that 1,000 years by the Greeks and Romans.
Right. It would be amazing if you can bring that to the United States, because we desperately need it as well.
Well, when you're rich and famous broadcaster, which I have no doubt you will be, you get me over to give some big lecture and I'll do it.
Yeah, I have the same feeling. As I mentioned, one of my majors was history, and I have the same feeling about history, where we don't teach history well at all. And when I met people that that find it boring, I was like, you just didn't have the right teachers. Because
you really did not.
Because
now,
it's
my oldest
impossible.
daughter is nearly 22. She's at London University and she's majoring in modern history, and she just gets so frustrated with people who don't want to know, that we didn't have the Race Relations Act till a certain year, or we didn't have abortion till a certain year. I mean, she likes modern history, but she finds the idea that people don't even care about where their rights came from.
Yeah, I think that's it's baffling, and it's also it's scary in some ways, because you have a society that doesn't know anything about its. That's why I get very frustrated when people talk about historical figures in the United States, because most people that talk about them don't know the full history. And it's a failure of our education system, because even in my school, we had we had such specific courses like 14th century Italy or something like that, but there was no general survey course on the history of Italy. How are you supposed to just know everything that came before and what came after,
or even know why on earth it might matter?
Yeah, exactly. And
why might it matter?
there are huge
I want
erosions.
want people to know that every time they use the word democratic, there is a very specific history of precisely 2,500 years duration where it's meant some very specific things, and throwing around this term as though it's a universal, not something incredibly short-lived that could easily be taken away.
Yeah. Obviously, in the interest of time, because we have a huge time difference, I like to finish off every podcast with two questions. One is, what gives you hope for society in general, and maybe your country or the United States state of affairs? And the last one is, what are 5 books on any topic that you would recommend to anyone?
Goodness me. Well, the first one's easy, and that is simply the young people I engage with all the time. I am so overwhelmingly impressed, given especially the dark COVID times, with the resilience, maturity, self-control, selflessness, and constructive responses, especially in terms of how people, how to use the internet to try and hang on to a sense of community. The way I have seen young people behave has moved me so much that I'm far more optimistically weirdly than I was 18 months ago. I really think the young people, and these include, of course, all my own undergraduates, but their response to a situation that I have never, ever had to endure in my young adulthood, I think you guys are far more responsible, thinking, and increasingly actually sort of anti-capitalist and pro-green and emotionally sophisticated. I think an awful lot of the models of just get rich quick and stuff the environment, stuff the future, these are not the dominant ideology now of young people. I think we're creating the sensible humans of the future. I think it's wonderful. All right, so that gives me hope. You give me hope. My daughters give me hope. My undergraduates give me hope. 5 books. Okay, so
it could be fiction or nonfiction. Let me just pre-spoil anything.
Okay, so
you can give more than 5 as well. Sorry.
Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. This is actually quite difficult. The Odyssey. Obviously, The Odyssey. Das Kapital. 1K Marx.
Yeah.
Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's all very Western, isn't it? And the complete works of Aristotle.
Beautiful. And your book.
Well, if you can't be bothered to read the complete works of Aristotle, you can get the summary in my book. Yeah.
Awesome. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and speaking with me.
Well, thank you. I found your questions unusual, and all the better for that.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.